Hi, welcome to Hillcrest Sermons, growing together.
Show us your heart's delight.
Good morning, friends. What a delight to see you, to be celebrating Advent together. Thank you, Roger and Therese. We're so delighted to be in partnership with you. As is usual, God is orchestrating His message to you in a number of different ways. There are times where we couldn't even imagine connecting all of the good ways that God wants to speak to His community. And I think that you'll see this morning in the reflections that came from campus ministry to even the announcements and discussion of holiday baskets and work we're doing right through the work at Sri Lanka, that God wants to paint a picture for you this morning. In fact, I'd ask you to hold in your mind that very image of a place. There's a place in Sri Lanka where things are hard all around, but there's a place where God's truth, love, and hope, and joy, and ice cream, and food for your family are still happening. There is a place where people aligned with God are providing God's loving kindness. And I would invite you to hold that picture and make it a complement to the rest of the pictures we look at this morning as we continue to celebrate Advent, this time of living life aligned with God because He came and because He's coming again. I think probably most of us have heard an expression that goes something like this. You are what you love. Or sometimes it is said, you are what you worship, right? You are what you love, you are what you worship. Interestingly, that is usually shared as a negative proverb, as a warning to loving the wrong things, right? Usually, you are what you love is like, well, don't love that because you'll become like that thing. But at its root is truly a wonderful idea. That is a fact about human beings, that when people worship and love what is good and worthwhile, they become that. People whose lives, the living of it, the expression of it is good and worthwhile. And when people do that, young and old, little kids, the oldest among us, when people do that, it's truly beautiful to see. It's especially beautiful when it stands in contrast to a self-serving majority. Like when a lot of people are looking out for themselves, it's particularly beautiful when somebody is looking out for others because they worship what is good and worthwhile. Their life becomes an expression of what is good and worthwhile. And it's just something that is ground into who we've been made. It's how the Creator fashioned us. I find it interesting that even if we stifle it or ignore it, even if many of us, not many of us, I don't think, but I speak of the human race, have sought to silence it or even sear it, the human heart is created to admire and express beauty, nobility, truth. It's literally how we're made. And sometimes our hardened hearts are betrayed by the things that we admire. We're drawn towards things that are admirable. I think I said a couple of weeks ago that it's true, and we can see that it is true. We know that the lurid sells. We know that kind of with like heart-beating anticipation, we can be drawn towards what is horrific. And that sells too. We've seen horror sell. But I think that it's a temporary leering at what is horrible, and that many human beings, at least a large part or some part, are still, sometimes it bothers them, inexorably drawn towards the beautiful, towards the good, towards the noble, towards the fair, towards the loving, towards the kind. I can't tolerate them, but I find Hallmark movies a good testimony. Right? But like Hallmark and Christmas movies, they're sorry if you love them. They're awful, but good too, right? But they still make billions of dollars because care and kindness and community and love are still deeply ingrained, even in the broken human heart. Even if we look around and see that culture or the period of Judges makes us think, oh, that's totally eradicated, something in the human heart still desires these things. And that's where we've got to spend our time in Advent. We came out of Judges, but we got to make this switch into the book of Ruth last week. And Ruth is this breath, this bright spot in the story of Judges that expresses the kind of community we've heard testified this morning. And we get to dwell for 4 weeks, quite honestly, almost in a Hallmark movie. It's a cute little country town where the citizens are decent, where a stranger wanders in from afar and finds herself, where their heroes are worthy and strong. It's a good story with God's loving kindness on display. If you weren't with us, I'd invite you to catch up. We laid some groundwork last week, especially as it regards the word Hesed. So if you haven't caught it, go back and catch up. You can do that on any of our platforms. Also, I'd invite you to start opening your Bible there. So if you want to start making your way to Ruth, it's kind of still far left in your Bible right after the book of Judges. The story, as I said already, the story of Ruth, and I tried to point out, it's the story of Ruth, it's the story of Naomi, it's the story of Boaz. These are our 3 primary players, and it's really a story of the people of Israel trying to share all hope is not lost. Do we kind of not live? There's sort of these days a lot of like, all hope is lost. You know, this is it. This is the great decline. And just when people would thought all hope is lost, here's a sign that all hope is not lost. It's set within this context in the period of the Judges. And last week we spelled out a little bit still what in the period of the Judges looks like. But I can simplify it by the moral compass of the nation was broken. So everything pointed backwards and upside down. And the author of Judges most often summarized it as, in those days, everybody did whatever they wanted to do. It was a time that was violent and chaotic and selfish. And yet, what happens in the book of Ruth is that we have this wide-angle view kind of everybody, right? Speaking of Israel, and for a while we zoomed in and pulled out a few horrible examples, but we were still painting with a very broad brush. All of Israel was like this. What this author does is allows us to zoom into another small angle, again, to say not actually all of Israel was like this. Like a bright star in a dark field, Ruth stands out as an example, a pocket, a place where people are still trusting God and carrying out life with one another and with creation in ways that honor Him, that express who He is. Their lives become an expression of what they worship and love. They become an example of who God is. So in this case, we're back in Bethlehem, or Bethlehem, the house of bread. We've got an older Israelite woman, dazed, confused, and she would say empty, right? She has been emptied, beat up. She has come back to town in a hard place. And then we have this Ruth, the Moabite, an illegal refugee, who is back in Bethlehem with her. And she, quite frankly, has no prospects. Neither of them do. They come into town absolutely empty-handed. Naomi describes herself as empty. And they're coming into town just as after a long famine, a harvest is finally being gathered. So there's finally going to be food. And the storyteller has put them sort of in God's hands. Let's just see what happens with this. Again, in the framework of Ruth, we should expect nothing good will happen. I'm in the framework of Judges, right? So we've been set up to expect, well, nothing good will happen. The period of Judges has taught them to fear the worst. And instead, it already began, we'll get to see them for the next few weeks receive what I would call lavish Hesed, kindness. Now, I said last Sunday that in some ways, Ruth can be considered an exploration of this Hebrew word. Hesed that comes from God's description of himself. And like I said, if you didn't catch this last week, I'd encourage you to go back. Hesed is the way God says, and I tried to simplify it. God is himself steadfast, lovingly kind, and faithful, and desires to make a people who are steadfast, lovingly kind, and faithful as a testimony to who he is. So last week we focused on this unexpected testimony to God's chesed, his loving kindness. Ruth, the Moabite, becomes this living expression. God's chesed is expressed through this Moabite woman. This week, I'm going to primarily focus on how chesed is expressed through an Israelite man. Now, I say primarily because last week with Ruth, we saw it in Orpah, and we saw it in Naomi. We saw how Hesed begets chesed, loving kindness, and the same thing today. We'll focus on Boaz, but we're going to see how it multiplies effects. Because Boaz shows loving kindness, it is multiplied in the people who are around him. And so it kind of shares itself all the way around. So finally, let's jump in. We're going to be in Ruth chapter 2. Like I said, I encourage you to bring a Bible. If you don't have one, we have them for free. Just grab one on your way out today. Bring something you can write in and flip pages and draw arrows and circle around. Explore this text that has been saved for us. So here we are, the exploration of chesed, loving kindness in an Israelite man. I'd like to say, since we were in the story of Gideon, no Israelite man has been introduced by name that did not follow with horror. Like, to introduce an Israelite man by name for a while has been bad news. I'm telling you this guy's name so that you'll remember what a horrific person this actual individual was. And so, remember, we're tuned up for that. So here we're going to have this introduction of another Israelite by name, and that's important. And we read it in that context. Like I said, you've been watching zombie movies. Now you're watching Hallmark. You've got to switch gears about when you're introduced to a new character. So let's pick it up in 2:1, which kicks off our story. It says, now Naomi, again, I'm going to say this lots of times. Ruth is the author's fascination. Naomi is the plot center. It's what happens to Naomi. Boaz is the hero. So now Naomi had a relative on her husband's side. This is the setup. A man of standing, which means a man of noble character. So it doesn't just mean like he was popular or he had a government position. He's a person of good character. So right away we're setting as a person of noble character, and here's the kicker, from the clan of Elimelech, her husband, whose name was Boaz. And this is sort of like in the movie, in walks our hero, right? So here is Boaz in this story. It just so happens that he's a man of noble character and he's related to Elimelech. Now, our author's going to use a phrase that I've talked about before throughout the story, and I'll point it out in a moment, where he says something like, and so it came to be, or it turns out, or as it happens. It just so happens that this happened to this. Now, of course, our author here does not believe that these things are accidentally happening. This is a playful description of God's sovereign hand at work. It's got a little wink in it, right? Whoops. Just so happens he was in exactly the right place at the right time. Just when they thought all was lost, God was out of control, nobody was doing anything, all was chaos, just so happens that the whole time God is watching along. Just so happens she's in the right place at the right time. So here it is, the discovery of Boaz. And again, like I said, we should be asking, we've been introduced by name, what kind of man is Boaz? Now, you heard it read in verse 2 this morning. Again, we keep focusing on all these characters, and I wish we had time to unpack it all. But verse 2 said something like, Ruth goes to her mom and says, hey, I'm going to go out and glean. I want you to recognize what a courageous thing that I'm an illegal refugee in a small town. How about I head out on my own and see how that goes? I just like the author, I'm like, Ruth, man, that is an admirable woman. what you're going to see a lot is, I said, it just so happens. Notice that it just so happens because Ruth stayed in motion. Oh, man, do I wish we had time there. God's sovereign hand is playing out as faithful people stay in motion. If she had not done this, none of the it just so happens would have folded out with her. So she goes out, and I love that Naomi has the guts to say to her, because I think Naomi would have been like, you're nuts, don't do that, it won't work out. Remember, Naomi's a little Eeyore at this moment. And so Naomi's like, no, go for it, go out there to see what happens. So, verse 3. So she went. I just love this. Entered a field and began to glean behind the harvesters, which is amazing. She's not kicked out of the field, nothing. She begins to glean. Ready? As it turned out. That's it just so happens, same phrase. As it turned out, she was working in a field belonging to Boaz, who we just met, who was from the clan of Elimelech. So here's our scene's been set up. Now the author begins in verse 4. Now, sadly, the NIV softened this. It says, just then Boaz arrived, but that's not the Hebrew at all. The Hebrew is, behold, exclamation point. So it's like a hard lens shift. Right here we have this story of Naomi and Ruth. What's going to happen? How does God solve this? And then, bam, the lens shifts over to Boaz. Behold, Boaz comes on the scene. What's going to happen? And Boaz is this prefigurement, we said last week, of a great leader king who is to come. The author keeps setting up David. We know he's not setting up David, but David's greater hope, Jesus, right? So behold, here comes Boaz. Here, what's he like? Behold, Boaz comes. Arrives from Bethlehem, and he greets the harvesters. The Lord be with you. And then we heard this. And they responded, the Lord bless you. A lot is shared in a few sentences, because what we see about Boaz already is we can just glean from this. He's a good man and a good leader. He comes into town, he doesn't say, how much work have you done? Show me how much money you have made. First thing is, I greet these people. He greets them with a blessing of the Lord. And how do they respond? The Lord bless you back. We see like a good relationship between Boaz and the people in his field. So already you see the nobility of his character spelled out. Here's a God-faithful person who loves the people he works with. And here's the beauty. They love him in return. He's a Hesed, faithful kind of guy, and he receives Hesed faithfulness in return. In a time where the reader has been tuned to see mutual jealousy and underhanded malice, instead we're treated to mutual blessing and friendship. Hesed expressed in God's people. Well, this is where the story gets straight up Hallmark. So we're going to pick it up in verses 5 through 9. And as I read verses 5 through 9, I want you to reflect on this question. Where do you see God's Hesed kindness? Like as you hear me, go, oh, there. If you're marking your Bible, that's very Hesed of them. It's a thing you might say, right? So as I read it, look for spots. So continue the story. It says, Boaz says to the overseer of his harvesters, likely another young man, hey, who does that young woman belong to? Just saying he noticed, yeah. The overseer replies, I love this. Remember, ethnicity is a character in this book. She's a Moabite who came back from Moab with Naomi. And she said to us, please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the harvesters. And she came into the field, and she's remained here from morning until now, except for a short rest in the shelter. So Boaz turns and says to Ruth, my daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field, and don't go away from here. Stay here with the women who work for me. Watch the field where the men are harvesting, and follow along after the women. I have told the men not to lay a hand on you. And whenever you are thirsty, go and get a drink from the water jars the men have filled. Now, that is a very interesting cultural thing going on there. Those men got water from themselves. You go drink some of their water. It would be fun to unpack. So here, we see now they show up, and already we begin to see this reciprocal Hesed, kindness. Could you guys just anybody have just call out, where's a place where you go, oh, that was kind, one for another? Anybody try one? Just call it out or raise a hand. Somebody be bold. Where's a place you saw kindness expressed? Yeah, I like that. Yes. Anybody else got another one? Oh, that was good of each other. I get one more? Yes. Here you have this vulnerable person, and he makes this clear declaration of protection. If you look later on, Ruth says the same thing or Naomi says the same thing to Ruth. Hey, stick in that field, because if you were in any other field, you are likely to get hurt. So let's just name a few other ones. I want you to notice that Boaz's workers were already being kind and showing Hesed to Ruth before Boaz gets there. Boaz doesn't get there and break up a fight. Boaz doesn't get there and correct bad behavior. His workers are already expressing his culture when he gets there. Hey, who's this? She's been working behind us all day long. She hasn't taken a break. She's been at it the whole day. So we see them already not harassing this woman, this illegal refugee. They're already showing Hesed kindness. They're already obeying the law, which may not seem like a big deal, but in the period of Judges, not a lot of law obedience has been going on. Leviticus 19 clearly says, do not glean the corners of your field. Leave that, because the poor will come behind you. Intentionally, don't take everything, so that some people can have something left. Now, I'm going to point this out in a minute, but it's amazing that they're already doing this. They're already leaving something for her, and they're not shushing her away. As their women become behind them, they are still allowing the poor to gather behind them, which is quite extraordinary. And I think it's extraordinary that Boaz doesn't come in and mad that his crop is being shared with a stranger. This could have gone, who's that? Oh, she's been here gathering stuff all day. Who told her she could have my stuff? That's what we would have expected. Who told her she could have things that belong to me? And instead what we see is like 360 degrees of Hesed. Kindness and courage and kindness and loving kindness expressed. Hesed is just multiplying more Hesed, which is multiplying more Hesed. In verse 10, I love this. What happens is, so that she comes in verse 10. At this, Ruth, she bows down with her face to the ground, and she asks him, why have I found such favor in your eyes that you notice me? Didn't we just point this out? You see me. If you think in Sri Lanka, what have we done that you see me to our neighbor? And here, literally, this is setting up the I see you because God sees the vulnerable. Why would you notice me? She notices that this would be weird. And I love that she isn't kowtowing. She isn't apologizing. She's not shamed or shunned. And she also doesn't respond in cowering fear or entitlement. She's not coweringly afraid of, but she also doesn't say, this is what you have to do. This is mine. You should be giving me this. Neither of those things. There's just this thankful gratitude expressed back to thankful generosity. Verses 11 through 17 show Boaz and his crew crossing over from kind of legal generosity into lavish, abundant generosity. So they say, yes, you can glean behind. You're going to watch, if you read the story, that Boaz and his workers allow there to be just abundant generosity. I'll give you a couple of examples. In verse 14, there's a break, and Boaz treats Ruth, you could say, it's showing a little interest, to a picnic. So he says, why don't you come and eat some of my food, since we're going to sit down and eat together? And he feeds her this a very good meal, all things considered. They sit and eat together, and she leaves that meal with leftovers. And then he pulls his men together when they're going back to work, and he says this in verse 15. He says, hey, let her gather right among the sheaves. So not wait, like where you're at. without stopping her. And don't just let her pick up the stuff around you, but after you've gathered a sheaf, what I want you to do is just pull out a sheaf that you've gathered and drop it on the ground from the bundles and drop them on purpose. Now, ain't nobody, she's not dumb and they're not dumb about this. Everybody sees what's going on, right? Says, let her pick them up and don't give her a hard time about it. No shame about this. Like, I want you to drop an abundance before her. Don't embarrass her. If you were to move your finger down to verse 17, apparently they do this all day because when she goes back to her mother-in-law, it says that she brought an ephah of grain back with her. Again, these don't make automatic sense to her, but this is about 40 pounds of barley that she brings back with her. So she brings back her leftovers and 40 pounds of grain. This is a lavish abundance of grain. I think it's clear that Boaz likes Ruth. Here's what I would like us to especially notice about this abundant, steadfast, loving kindness that's being expressed in expressed in Boaz's workers because Boaz expresses it. This is the culture in this pocket of good news. I want us to notice that given every other factor, the fact that they shared abundantly is quite remarkable. Given her ethnicity, we talked about that last week, as a Moabite, it would have been at least accepted if they had not been generous with her. Given their own history and what they've been going through, generosity would not have been expected. Given the period of the judges, it would especially not be expected. Given the culture of the time of greed and malice, it would not have been expected. But mostly, they've been coming out of 10 years of famine. So they and their kids have been hungry. They've been hungry. And when you've been hungry and you finally have food, I think that they would have been inclined to do what? Keep it. Hoard it for themselves, right? And if sharing, at least be reasonable about the sharing. Careful, maybe even modestly stingy. Sure, we'll share, but not too much. And we don't have to go very far in our imagination to remember what this looks like, do we? Let me show you March 2020. You could not get bananas or top ramen. Why? Because people hoarded it. Because they hated their neighbor? No. They just wanted to make sure their family was okay. It would have been natural for I just want to make sure my family's okay. I'm gathering up a little because I want to make sure my family is okay. Now, put yourself in that context. It's been a 10-year famine. And Boaz, yes, okay, we're going to obey the law. You can glean a little. Finally, we're gathering food, and Boaz says, I want you to take the food out of our own mouths, drop it on the ground, and let the foreigner pick it up. I think the expectation would be like, that is too far, friend. I appreciate that you're trying to be kind, but I need this box of top ramen just in case something bad happens. And again, what we see is Hesed kindness, Hesed kindness, Hesed kindness. They share generously and they trust in the goodness of God and in their leader, Boaz. And again, it's supposed to warm our hearts because it is lovely. But it even gets better. So, Ruth goes home. She dumps this obviously absurd abundance at Naomi's feet, and we begin to see Naomi's recovery. The author builds the plot around Naomi. Naomi left for Bethlehem and arrived in Bethlehem hungry and afraid. In Moab, she had lost everything, her husband, her sons, her protection, her provision, her prospects, her future. All things were lost. In fact, let's reread the assessment of her own life in chapter 1, verses 19 and 20. She says, in 2021, she says, don't call me Naomi, which means which means sweet or lovely. She told them, call me Mara, which means bitter, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why would you call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me. That's how Naomi thinks of herself. Now, let's reread verses 19 through 20, which we heard read this morning. So Boaz has done this. Ruth has come home and dumped this abundance at her feet. And now, here's what Naomi says. Her mother-in-law asks her, "Where did you go and glean today? Where did you work? Blessed be the man who took notice of you." Then Ruth told her mother-in-law about the one whose place she had been working. "The name of the man I worked at today is Boaz," she said. "The Lord Yahweh bless him, Boaz," Naomi said to her daughter-in-law. Now listen, the he that I'm about to read is not Boaz, but Yahweh. This is much clearer in Hebrew, that the subject of the next sentence is Yahweh, not Boaz. So he could be just replaced with Yahweh. Yahweh has not stopped showing his, under kindness, underline that, his Hesed to the living and the dead. She added, that man is our close relative. He is one of our guardian or kinsman redeemers. So here is Naomi, bankrupt, broken, and empty. And in this moment, her restoration begins because she says, wait, just when I thought everything was lost, broken, and terrible, now I can see that God's Hesed never stopped. It didn't stop even though to the dead, to my husband and sons who died, his loving kindness never stopped. To me, who felt lost and empty, his loving kindness never stopped. She's been restored, and the stage is sort of set for us to imagine what's going to happen. God will answer that in ways that are impossibly beyond she thought to ask or imagine even more. The question I want us to end with today is something like this. How is it that she's seeing God's loving kindness? How is Naomi's faith in God's loving kindness restored? It's restored because it's expressed in the people around her. The arrival and the Hesed of Boaz, who happens to be her family's kinsman redeemer, and we'll unpack that more later, is what restores her faith in God's Hesed kindness. Imagine if neither Boaz nor her worker or his workers had been loving and kind and faithful. Then this never would have happened for Naomi. It is because others were faithful. It was because of their Hesed kindness that Naomi's Hesed kindness in God is restored. Her Hesed assurance in the Father restored finally at the hand of an Israelite man instead of crushed at the hand of an Israelite man. And in one way and in one place, the horror of the book of Judges is restored. And the spiral of hope, instead of descending downward, returns to climbing upward again. A human being's faith in God was restored through the faithfulness of another. In the New Testament, for us, this idea is played out through Jesus over and over. It says, "Go in my name and live like I do." His disciple John says, God is love because of Jesus, and you are like Jesus. We can be God's Hesed, his Hesed living kindness in the world. There was a 16th century, she was a doctor, reformer of the church, Teresa of Avila, an emphatic writer, and she writes this idea quite emphatically in a poem, and I wanted to share it with you today. It says, Christ has no body now on earth but yours. No hands, no feet, but yours. Yours are the eyes through which he looks with compassion on this world. Yours are the feet with which he walks to do good. Yours are the hands through which he blesses all the world. Yours are the hands, yours are the feet, yours are the eyes. You are his body. Christ has no body now on earth but yours. And these words come up through the centuries. 3,000 years ago in Ruth, we see hopefulness restored and the faithfulness of another. 500 years ago in Spain, the message of Advent is fanned into flame. And those who are living in the middle, awaiting the return of Jesus, are encouraged again. Go live lives of Hesed kindness, you will become just what you love and worship. Love and worship what is noble and good and true and faithful. Love the God who is noble, true, and faithful and full of Hesed, and you too will lead a life that expresses Hesed kindness. And when you do, it will not just be, when we do, a declaration of truth, but can restore the hopefulness of those who've lost it around us. This chapter in Ruth ends with the setup for the next, verse 23, and Tim will pick up chapter 3 next week. Verse 23 says, "But Ruth stayed close to the women of Boaz to glean until the barley and wheat harvest," that's another 3 months, "were finished. And she lived with her mother-in-law," and it is set up to see what is going to happen. We'll see that as the heat of summer was reaching Bethlehem, that's not all that's heating up. And Boaz and Ruth are catching feelings, and this story is good. It turns out to be funny, romantic, and kind. In a time that desperately needed Hesed kindness, it was shown. And I think the same could be said for us again. It is a time in the world where Hesed kindness is deeply needed. I think our worship team's going to make their way back up, and as they do, I'd love to just end with this question. As you consider Ruth, as you consider Sri Lanka, as you consider our life and work together, I think a good question at Advent, as we're celebrating Jesus' coming and anticipating his return, is to ask ourselves this question: where do we see the need for God's steadfast, loving kindness in the world around us? And friends, often we think of this giant scale, but I'd encourage you to think of your friends or your roommates, your kids or your parents. Hesed starts at home, might be a nice way to say it. And then look out from you. Loving kindness is desperately needed in this day. May God give you the joy, the anticipation, and the fruitfulness of showing it. In his good name, amen.
Thanks for listening. For more info, visit hcbellingham.com and join us any Sunday, 9 and 11 a.m.